I have often found that history is not written in the quiet scratching of a quill, but in the deafening roar of guns, the clash of blades, and the silence that follows. It is a silence I have known too often, for I am Gas Havelock, chronicler of the Iron Hands Legion, and I have walked the shadow of their tragedy for most of my life. The tale I commit to record is not merely one of battles and victories, nor even of betrayal and loss. It is the story of a people who sought perfection by shedding their own flesh, of a Primarch whose will was forged in the crucible of a hostile world, and of a brotherhood shattered upon the anvil of ambition. It begins, as all things of iron must, in the furnace. Medusa was no cradle for life, no gentle world to raise poets or dreamers. It was a land of blackened mountains that clawed at the sky, of glaciers that groaned with ancient weight, of rivers that flowed not with water, but molten rock in the volcanic belts. Geysers of scalding steam burst from the ground without warning. The wind cut like glass, bearing with it the scree and dust of 1,000 years of erosion. It was here, amidst this eternal hostility, that the people of Medusa learned the creed that would define them: the flesh is weak. Not as an abstract thought, but as a truth written in scars and missing limbs. On Medusa, the body failed, to frostbite, to stonefalls, to the grinding gears of ancient, half-functioning machinery from the dark age of technology. Survival meant replacing what was lost with what could not fail. Metal did not grow tired. Circuits did not hunger. Steel did not freeze in the cold. The Iron Hands were born of this world, and their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, was its truest son. When the Emperor's great work scattered his sons to the void, Ferrus's capsule fell here, into a storm-lashed valley at the edge of the shattered range. As a child, he was alone, but Medusa does not allow children to remain so for long. Either they join a clan, or they die. The clans that roamed the glaciers were nomads, forever moving in great tracked haulers and ice crawlers, avoiding the shifting fault lines that could swallow entire caravans in moments. They took him in, not out of charity, but because he proved his worth quickly. The boy who would be Primarch had hands that could coax dying engines back to life, who could spot a fracture in steel with a glance, who could lift more than men twice his age. And yet it was not his strength that set him apart. It was the look in his eyes, a constant measuring of the world, as though he were weighing every man, every storm, every mountain in the balance and finding them wanting. There was no romance in him, no boy's dreams of glory. From the beginning, he believed only in what could endure. Even as a youth, his life was a chain of trials. I have read the clan records, sparse though they are, and each one tells of a feat that would have made another a legend. The time he dove beneath a collapsing ice shelf to retrieve a vital engine core, his bare arms blew from the glacial water as he hauled it free. The day he stood between a hunting pack of steel-jawed ice predators and the children of the caravan, armed with nothing more than a length of iron pipe. Always he returned alive. Always he carried the scars as if they were medals. It is said that the first great change came upon him when he faced the Wirm. The beast was a relic from some forgotten age, its scales like adamantium, its breath scalding enough to melt stone. Ferrus fought it alone for an entire day and night, his skin seared, his muscles torn, until at last he drowned it in the molten river that ran through the valley. But the creature's death was not the end. When he emerged, his hands were no longer of flesh, but of living silvered metal, impervious to heat, unyielding to blade. Whether this was the Emperor's design or the touch of something more mysterious, none can say. Ferrus never spoke of it, save to call them the proof that weakness could be overcome. By the time the Emperor found him, Ferrus was already a warlord among the clans, uniting them not by promises, but by victories. His voice carried the authority of one who had never been defeated, and his presence alone was enough to still disputes. When the Emperor came, radiant in gold, Ferrus did not kneel. The two regarded each other as smiths regard a fine piece of work, not with awe, but with the careful eye of a craftsman. It is said they spoke for an entire day in the tongue of engineers, discussing alloys, stress tolerances, the forging of armies. Only at sunset did Ferrus accept his place at the Emperor's side. The legion that bore his name, the Iron Hands, reflected him in all things. They adopted the Medusan creed, building it into their very identity. Flesh was weakness, iron was strength. They replaced what failed, not in shame, but in pride. Augmentation was not seen as the loss of humanity, but as its perfection. Each victory was a proof of concept, each scar replaced with steel another step toward their ideal. It was during the Great Crusade that Ferrus met Fulgrim, the Phoenician, and I must confess, when I study those early records, I see no sign of the shadow that would later fall between them. In those days, they were brothers in truth. Fulgrim was everything Ferrus was not, elegant where he was stern, charismatic where he was curt, a master of aesthetics where Ferrus was a master of function. And yet they respected one another deeply, each recognizing in the other a pursuit of perfection. Where Fulgrim sought beauty, Ferrus sought strength, and for a time, those ideals did not clash but complemented each other. I have seen hololiths of them in the days of triumph, standing side by side after a conquest, Ferrus with his gauntlet arms crossed, Fulgrim with his sword raised in a flourish, their legions arrayed behind them in the glory of the Great Crusade. They fought together often, their forces meshing with uncanny precision, the Iron Hands breaking the enemy lines, the Emperor's children striking with flawless execution. In those days, there was laughter between them, the easy familiarity of comrades who have bled in the same mud. But even in those golden hours, there were hints, so small that only hindsight reveals them. A glance from Ferrus when Fulgrim lingered too long over the spoils of victory. A touch of impatience when the Phoenician praised the artistry of a captured weapon instead of its killing efficiency. Still, they were brothers, and in those days, that bond seemed unbreakable. And perhaps that is what makes the rest of this history so hard to tell. For the higher the tower, the greater the fall, and when iron shatters, it leaves edges sharp enough to wound forever. If the Great Crusade had been a forge, then Ferrus and Fulgrim had been two hammers striking in unison, their blows ringing with perfect rhythm. But even the finest tools wear with use, and harmony can turn to dissonance before its wielder realizes the change. I did not see it then, but the seeds of their undoing had already been sown in the soil of their victories. It began as the smallest of shifts. In the early years, Fulgrim had been as meticulous in his strategy as he was in his art, his every strike a blend of beauty and precision. Yet, as the campaigns wore on, something changed in him. Ferrus was the first to sense it, not in words, but in the slight delay of Fulgrim's responses on the Vox, in the way he now lingered over the slaughter as though it were a gallery to be admired rather than a field to be secured. On the Kadros front, the Emperor's children were tasked with a swift strike to sever the enemy's supply lines. The Iron Hands, already locked in brutal urban warfare, depended on their speed. Instead, Fulgrim's forces executed a complex flanking maneuver that took hours longer than planned, elegant in its design but leaving the Iron Hands isolated under heavy fire. The victory came eventually, but at the cost of hundreds of Medusan lives. Ferrus did not speak of it at first, but I have read the after-action report. His only comment: the enemy is not an audience to be impressed, but an obstacle to be destroyed. It was not the last time. In the Delazar campaign, Fulgrim insisted on personally leading a spearhead to take the capital's palace, even though the Iron Hands' breach of the northern gates would have ended the war within hours. Instead, the Phoenician staged his assault like a theater, striking at the most heavily defended point to prove the mettle of his legion. It worked, the palace fell in a blaze of glory, but the Iron Hands were left to mop up the remnants for weeks while Fulgrim basked in the accolades. Ferrus was a patient man by nature, but patience is a finite ore, and each campaign mined it further. I have seen his personal logs from this period, the terse entries growing sharper with each passing month. He began to speak of Fulgrim less as a brother-in-arms and more as a force to be accounted for, a variable in his calculations rather than a constant. Their conversations changed too. Once they had spoken as equals, trading thoughts on metallurgy, strategy, and the shaping of empires. Now, Ferrus found himself listening to Fulgrim's accounts of grand duels and artistic triumphs, victories described more for their style than their substance. When Ferris countered with tales of hard-won sieges and attrition warfare, Fulgrim's smile would tighten, as though the subject bored him. The break came closer to the surface during the Kitharus Purge. I recall the hololith footage, grainy, but clear enough to capture the tension. In the stratagem of the flagship Fist of Iron, Ferris laid out a direct assault plan: strike the orbital foundries, cripple the enemy's capacity to produce war material, then advance. Fulgrim stood across from him, resplendent in polished armor, and dismissed the plan as too blunt an instrument for such a delicate theater. "War is not delicate," Ferris replied, his voice like the grind of a millstone. "It can be," Fulgrim said, with that infuriating smile of his. "A perfect strike, brother, is like a masterwork blade, it kills with elegance, not brutish force." "And while you carve your masterpiece, men die," Ferris answered. There was no heat in his tone, only cold certainty, and in that moment I think Fulgrim realized that the admiration of his brother had begun to cool. Still, Ferris tried to reach him. In the private quarters of the Fist of Iron that night, they spoke without their legions to hear. Ferris, his voice low, reminded Fulgrim of the oath they had sworn to the Emperor, that victory was the only art worth mastering. Fulgrim listened, but the light in his eyes was distant, as though his thoughts wandered to another gallery entirely. "You see the galaxy as an anvil, brother," Fulgrim said at last. "I see it as marble, waiting to be shaped. You strike to break. I strike to create. And when the marble fights back?" Ferris asked. "Then it must be tamed," Fulgrim answered, as though it were obvious. There was no agreement that night, only a mutual silence that stretched between them like a fault line under strain. I believe now that Ferris still hoped to pull Fulgrim back, that he believed the Phoenicians' pride could be tempered by the bonds they had forged. But bonds can fray in ways even a master smith cannot repair, and each campaign seemed only to feed Fulgrim's hunger for recognition, for perfection on his own terms. The Iron Hands fought beside him still, but their pre-march had begun to watch his brother with the wary eye of a man who knows a blade can cut the hand that wields it. And somewhere in those years, though neither of them would admit it, the word brother became something they spoke out of habit, rather than truth. In the records of the Great Crusade, there are battles where victory tastes of ashes, where the cost overshadows the prize. But there are also battles that should never have been fought at all, wounds inflicted not by the enemy, but by one's own hand. The war that began between Ferris Menace and Fulgrim was such a wound, and I write of it now with the same sickness that must have settled over Medusa when news of it reached our forges. The first whispers came not from the imperial palace, but from the lips of those who had fought beside the emperor's children and lived to tell of it. Stories of a blade unlike any forged by human hands, a weapon whose whispers could turn victory into obsession, whose touch left warriors restless even in triumph. They called it the Laer blade, though in truth it had another name in the dark tongue of its makers, a name the Phoenician never spoke aloud. I cannot say when Fulgrim first took it into his grasp, but I know the man he was before and the man he became after. The change was not sudden, corruption rarely is. It began in his eyes, a glint of something fevered behind the polish, as though the blade had taught him secrets he could not unlearn. His orders grew riskier, his strategies more baroque, designed not for efficiency but for spectacle. Ferris noticed at once. In their early campaigns together, he had admired Fulgrim's artistry, even envied it in quiet moments. But now that artistry had turned into something else, an indulgence, a hunger for perfection that would consume all else. The turning point came on the world of Adermedion. The planet's defenders had already been broken, their armies shattered, their cities abandoned. All that remained was to secure the Manufactoria and prevent the enemy from regrouping. Ferris urged a rapid strike, to finish the work before the foe could flee into the mountains. Fulgrim, however, insisted on a full ceremonial assault, deploying his forces in a grand encirclement that allowed the enemy weeks to prepare their last stand. The result was a bloodbath, a victory bought with unnecessary loss. When Ferris confronted him afterward, the exchange was private, but the words have been preserved in the logs of the Fist of Iron. "You let them die for nothing," Ferrus said, his voice low but carrying the weight of iron striking an anvil. I gave them a death worthy of remembrance, Fulgrim replied, and in his tone was the faintest echo of mockery. It is not our task to make their deaths beautiful. Only to end them. You still think like a smith, brother. But the galaxy is not steel to be hammered into shape. It is a canvas, and it will be made perfect. It was then that Ferrus's gaze fell upon the weapon at Fulgrim's side, a sword of strange, iridescent metal, its edge seeming to ripple like oil on water. He had never seen its like, and though he did not yet know its nature, something in him recoiled from it. In the weeks that followed, Fulgrim's path diverged entirely from the Emperor's will. His messages to Ferrus grew infrequent, curt where once they had been full of detail. When the summons came for the muster at Istvan, it bore Fulgrim's seal but not his hand. By then, the truth was spilling through the Vox net like oil on the tide. Fulgrim had turned his back on the Imperium, throwing his legion into rebellion alongside Horus. I imagine Ferrus's thoughts in those moments, for though I was not there, I have seen the man's fury. He was not quick to anger, but when it came, it was as relentless as a glacier grinding down a mountain. And yet beneath that rage was something far worse, grief. For all his cold pragmatism, Ferrus Manus loved his brothers, and to see one fall was to feel a part of himself torn away. He might have avoided the confrontation. Many would have counseled caution, to strike at the traitors without facing Fulgrim directly. But that was not his way. Ferrus was a smith. When a flaw appeared in the work, he met it with hammer and tongs, even if it meant breaking the piece entirely. And so he went to meet the Phoenician, not as an enemy to be slain from afar, but as a brother to be judged face to face. The meeting took place in the ruins of a city they had once taken together during the Crusade, its streets now silent save for the distant thunder of war. Fulgrim stood amid the rubble like a figure from some twisted sculpture, his armor gleaming, the Laer blade resting easily in his grip. You came, Fulgrim said, as though it were a matter of curiosity, not inevitability. I came, Ferrus answered, to hear from your own lips that the rumors are true. They are, Fulgrim said without hesitation. The Emperor's vision is flawed. He would bind us to mediocrity, to the shackles of human frailty. I have seen a higher path. Ferrus stepped closer, the metallic fingers of his silver hands tightening. You have seen nothing but the lies that blade whispers in your ear. Fulgrim's smile widened, and for a moment Ferrus thought he saw something move along the weapon's surface, like veins pulsing beneath the metal. I offer you a choice, Fulgrim said. Come with me. Leave behind the chains of weakness. We could remake the galaxy, you and I, as we once dreamed. Ferrus's reply was as final as the strike of a hammer. I will not betray the Emperor. And I will not follow you into madness. What passed between them then was not merely the clash of warriors, but the sundering of a bond that had once been unbreakable. Fulgrim's laughter turned cold, and the Laer blade sang as it left its sheath. The battle that followed would be spoken of in whispers even among the legions. Ferrus fought with a fury born of love and betrayal. Each blow meant not only to kill, but to break the corruption that had taken hold of his brother. Fulgrim matched him stroke for stroke, his every movement a work of terrible elegance, the blade in his hand seeming to anticipate Ferrus's strikes. They fought until the streets themselves were scarred, until the stones beneath them were shattered and slick with blood. But the Laer blade was not a weapon to be resisted forever. In the end, Fulgrim's strike found its mark, piercing the armor Ferrus had trusted as he had once trusted the man who wielded it. Ferrus did not fall at once. He stood, blood running down the silver of his hands, and looked into the eyes of the brother who had killed him. You were the best of us, Ferrus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Fulgrim's expression faltered, just for a heartbeat, and then the mask returned. Ferrus fell, and with him fell the last unbroken piece of the bond they had shared. The sky above Istvan V was the color of old iron, choked with the ash of burning forests and the drifting shrapnel of shattered war machines. The earth groaned beneath the weight of war, each bombardment shook the bedrock, each strike from the heavens scarred the already bleeding world. To the loyalists of the Imperium, this was a battlefield. To Ferrus Manus, it was the crucible in which truth would finally be tested. The iron hands descended like a storm upon the blackened plains, their armor dulled by ash and dust but their resolve unyielding. The ground cracked under the advance of Medusan war engines, great tracked behemoths grinding forward alongside the silent, relentless warriors of the 10th Legion. Bolter fire spat in controlled bursts, the disciplined rhythm of soldiers who fought not for spectacle, but for efficiency. Yet today, Ferrus's heart did not beat with the cold calm of logic. It thundered, hot and unmeasured, each pulse driving him closer to the one he had once called brother. Fulgrim's forces surged to meet them. The Emperor's children moved like dancers in the slaughter, their purple and gold armor unscathed in the opening clash, their blades glinting with impossible perfection. They were beautiful in a way that was wrong, beauty sharpened into a weapon. Even from a distance, Ferrus could see the signs of corruption, the strange, unnatural fluidity of movement, the shimmering, almost oily patterns in the colors of their armor, the way their eyes lingered too long on the carnage they wrought. When the first lines met, the air filled with the sound of steel against steel, the scream of dying engines, and the roaring voices of men who had forsaken the bond of brotherhood. Ferrus led from the front, each blow of his hammer flattening traitors into the mud, each strike fueled by the cold fury building within him. His Vox channel was alive with reports of shifting lines, of loyal allies falling to betrayal. Names he had known for decades were cut short in a blur of static and death. But in the distance, standing calm amidst the whirlwind, Fulgrim watched. His blade, the one Ferrus had once admired for its craftsmanship, shimmered in the ash-filled light. The Laer blade, Ferrus now knew, was more than just a weapon. It was a poison, a whispering tongue that had wound its way into his brother's soul. The knowledge sat in his gut like molten lead, each step toward Fulgrim feeling heavier than the last. When they finally faced one another, the battle seemed to fall away. The world shrank to the space between them, two primarchs, forged together in the fires of war, now standing on opposite sides of the same battlefield. Ferrus's voice was raw when he spoke, his words like iron striking stone. "This ends now, Fulgrim." The reply was not the voice Ferrus remembered. It was smooth, mocking, laced with a cruel amusement. "Oh, Ferrus, still clinging to your crude ideals, still blind to what you could become. The Emperor's leash has made you small." Ferrus's grip on his hammer tightened. "And chaos has made you nothing." Fulgrim's smile did not falter, but there was a glint in his eyes that was not entirely his own. "Chaos has made me free." They came together with the force of colliding worlds. Ferrus's hammer struck like the fall of an avalanche, Fulgrim's blade answering with impossible speed. Sparks leapt into the air, their clash sending shockwaves through the torn earth. Each blow Ferrus landed rattled Fulgrim's bones, but the Phoenician strikes cut deeper, faster, always finding the narrowest gap in Ferrus's guard. For all his skill, Ferrus was not fighting with the cold precision that had once been his greatest strength. Rage burned through him, clouding his judgment, urging him to strike harder, faster, without thought for defense. Fulgrim saw it, and he used it, turning aside Ferrus's blows with subtle shifts, drawing him into overextension, punishing each moment of reckless commitment. The duel dragged through the chaos around them, their movements carving a swath of ruin through the battle. Loyal iron hands tried to reach their primarch, but the Emperor's children closed ranks, cutting them down with vicious elegance. The two brothers were alone, yet surrounded by the war they had once fought side by side. Fulgrim's blade began to find purchase. A cut along Ferrus's side. Another through the armor at his shoulder. The Laer blade whispered in the din, its dark voice winding through Fulgrim's mind, promising glory, promising perfection, promising that this was the moment to erase the last chain that bound him. Ferrus roared and brought his hammer down in a final, desperate arc, a blow meant to end it all. Fulgrim stepped inside the swing, the movement as precise as it was inevitable. The Laer blade slid through Ferrus's chest with the sound of tearing metal, the whisper becoming a triumphant scream in Fulgrim's ear. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Ferris's breath came shallow, his eyes locked on the brother who now stood so close. In that moment, he did not see the traitor or the corrupted champion of chaos. He saw the brother he had once trusted, the warrior who had stood at his side when the galaxy seemed unconquerable. "You were, my brother," Ferris managed, his voice little more than a ragged whisper. Fulgrim's eyes flickered, perhaps a shadow of the man he had been, perhaps only the reflection of the dying light in Ferris's gaze. Then the blade withdrew, and Ferris fell to his knees, the world tilting, the battle fading to a distant thunder. He fell forward into the blackened earth, his hands sinking into the soil as if he could hold on to the world for just a moment longer. The last thing he heard was the roar of battle, and the echo of a friendship broken beyond repair. And then there was silence. The air aboard the Fist of Iron was not silence, it was the absence of breath, the absence of pulse. Men moved, but they moved like machines whose gears had lost their grease, sluggish and methodical, bound to duty but hollow of spirit. Word had spread long before the ship cleared the orbit of Istvan V. Ferris Menace, the Gorgon of Medusa, their Primarch, their father, was gone. Some refused to believe it. They told themselves that the storms of battle had swallowed him, that he fought still somewhere upon that cursed world. But denial could not endure against the psychic shock that washed through the Legion the moment his lifeblood spilled upon the black sands. It had been no mere battlefield rumor. Every iron hand, from the most grizzled veteran to the youngest neophyte, had felt the snap of the chain that bound their souls to his will. It was a sensation beyond words, a wrenching emptiness, as if some great internal engine had been ripped away and replaced with nothing. In the apothecarian bays, wounded warriors lay in serried ranks, staring at the steel bulkheads as if hoping they might peel away to reveal the face of their Primarch. Techmarines stalked among them, adjusting intravenous feeders and auto-sutures, but they spoke no comfort. Comfort was a thing of flesh, and flesh had failed them. I, Gas Havelock, found myself unable to write in those first hours. I had thought my quill an unerring weapon, able to carve history into permanence no matter the chaos around me. Yet here I was, staring at parchment that remained stubbornly blank. What words could stand beside the truth that Ferris Menace had been struck down by the hand of his own brother? What chronicle could make sense of a galaxy where loyalty shattered so completely? The Iron Council did not exist yet. That was to come later, born of necessity and forged from the Legion's refusal to bend beneath grief. In those first days, the Iron Hands existed only as fragments, companies and detachments adrift, cut off from their kin by the vast scatter of the drop site massacre. Communications were broken, command structures in tatters. But each fragment carried the same wound, and from that wound would grow something colder, sharper. Captain Cardan Stronos was among the first to speak of survival. His voice was iron when it rose over the comm-net, summoning what forces could answer. He spoke not of mourning but of rebuilding, of reforging the Legion in the image their Primarch had desired, or, perhaps, in the image they believed he had desired. The distinction would matter little in the years to come. I remember standing upon the command deck as Stronos addressed the gathered captains. Their armor bore the black scars of Istvan's betrayal, acid burns and gouged ceramite that had yet to be replaced. The red of fresh repairs was absent, no one had the will to paint over the wounds. Stronos's helm was clipped to his belt, his scarred face exposed to the light. "The flesh has failed us," he said. "The blood of our Gene Father has been spilled because weakness still walks in our ranks. No more. From this day forth, we shall purge it. We shall be as the machine, unyielding, incorruptible, eternal." Some nodded. Others stared at the deck, their grief unvoiced but heavy in the air. Yet none opposed him. Perhaps they feared that to do so would be to admit they wished to remain vulnerable. Perhaps they simply needed a new pillar to stand upon, now that the one they had worshipped lay broken on a traitor's blade. It was then that the first augmetics were ordered in bulk, not as battlefield repairs, but as deliberate replacements. Marines who had lost an arm or an eye to Istvan did not seek synthetic substitutes merely to fight again, they sought them as badges of honor, proof that they had excised their flawed flesh and replaced it with iron. Soon, warriors with no injury at all were requesting the same, removing hands, eyes, even beating hearts, trading them for cold perfection. In their minds, every gram of meat stripped away brought them closer to Ferris's ideal. But I had known Ferris. I had spoken with him in the quiet between campaigns, seen the way his gaze lingered on the distant peaks of Medusa when talk turned to his legion's future. His belief in augmentation had never been hatred of flesh, it had been a craftsman's hunger for improvement, the desire to make a tool sharper, stronger. He had laughed once, a rare sound, when I asked if he would ever replace his own heart. Some things, he said, are not meant to be forged. Would he have approved of what his sons were becoming now? Or would he have mourned them as he had mourned the weaknesses they once bore? The council formed in the weeks that followed. There was no singular successor who could bear the mantle of Primarch. Ferris had cast a shadow too vast for any one man to stand in. Instead, the captains gathered, each holding a fragment of his legacy, each sworn to speak for their clans and their companies. The Iron Council would be the Legion's mind, while its hands, the warriors, would carry out its will. In theory, it was unity. In truth, it was a machine of many cogs, each turning for the whole but grinding against the others in unseen ways. Still, the Legion moved forward. War demanded it. The Great Crusade did not halt for mourning, and the Horus Heresy least of all. The Iron Hand struck out not in vengeance alone, but in a cold, calculated campaign to excise weakness from the Imperium. They hunted the traitors when they could, dismantled the enemies of mankind where they found them, and in all things sought to prove that their iron had not rusted. I wrote again in those days, but my words tasted of oil and metal shavings. I described victories without joy, strategies without pride. The Iron Hands no longer fought for the Emperor's dream or even for their own honor, they fought because the machine must turn, because motion itself was survival. To stop would be to admit the wound could not be repaired. And yet, when I walked the forges, I still saw Ferris's touch in the way a tech marine polished a newly forged weapon, in the way a warrior adjusted the settings on his servoarm before battle. His spirit lingered not in the steel that replaced their flesh, but in the hands that shaped it, in the pride they took in their craft. They thought themselves becoming machines, but I knew better. Machines do not mourn. Machines do not remember. And the Iron Hands remembered every moment. Years from now, when the galaxy is quiet and the forges have cooled, perhaps they will look back and see the truth, that their Primarch's greatest strength was never his iron, but the human heart that beat beneath it. But for now, they march on, iron in their limbs, grief in their veins, and I, Gas Havelock, will write their story until my own flesh fails. For though flesh is weak, memory endures. I have watched the Iron Hands for longer than most men live. I have watched their forges flame and die, their banners rise and be torn, their numbers be thinned and reformed. Time for them is a lathe, things are turned, reshaped, measured against rubrics that only they would call honest. After the heresy, after the Black Day at Istvan and the fall that bled them into new shapes, the Legion did not so much rebuild as recalibrate. That recalibration was patient, ruthless, and inexorable. It called itself the Grand Calculation. The words are not mine alone, they have been carved into the cores of servitors, embedded as subroutines in the cogitators of war centuries, whispered in the quiet maintenance bays by tech marines who speak more to gear than to one another. The Grand Calculation began as an administrative program, logistics, losses, attrition rates. It matured into doctrine, a compendium of every failure the Legion had ever suffered and the corrective measures to expunge them. Where once a captain would weigh the merits of a plan with counsel and the slow churn of human debate, now the calculation presented outcomes in cold, crystalline certainty. Its calculus was simple: weakness introduces entropy, entropy kills, reduce weakness, reduce death. They called it vengeance at first, an appropriate, hot thing. Vengeance for the Primarch, for the brothers turned traitor, for every name cut off the vox that still made the throat of an iron hand constrict. Vengeance burned through the years that followed the heresy like an accelerant. Campaigns were launched to punish, to recover, to make the galaxy remember the cost of treachery. But vengeance could not be the end. Vengeance fades, it is a wound, not a likeness. So vengeance wedded itself to calculation, and the two produced something sterner. Where anger is a flare, calculation is a furnace that endures. The iron hands bent themselves to both. The heat rearranged them. Their methods became clinical. Reconnaissance was no longer simply probing, it was full-spectrum analysis. Data feeds pulsed through arrays of sensors, predictive models ran scenarios of enemy choices, and when units met the foe, the engagement unfolded like the enactment of a previously computed theorem. Battles were waged to minimize unknowns. When unknowns could not be eliminated, they were transformed into certainties by attrition. Slow did not mean weak, slow meant controlled. Yet that control was a form of cruelty, because it did not spare the human heart. It excused augmentation not as repair but as insurance. It argued that to be iron-made was not to be less than human, but to be more certain. I have seen whole companies volunteer for replacement tactile arrays, for bone-to-steel osseointegration, for ocular refractors that filter and prioritize enemy signatures. I have seen commanders authorize the removal of biological limbs from men who had not yet lost them, who sought the security of metal because it made them feel shielded from the treachery of chance. There is a terrible grace to watching a warrior accept such a change, the steady nod when the clamps close, the slow exhale as hydraulic servos engage and the weight of iron becomes part of the self. Yet that same grace is a kind of funeral. At every clinic where the scalpel kissed flesh goodbye, someone else recorded the absence and added it to the ledger. The ledger was a ledger in truth, rows of losses, replacements, calibrations, and a cold-eyed ranking of what further changes might reduce casualty curves. Isolation followed naturally. Where the Iron Hands had once fought shoulder to shoulder with other legions, now they preferred to carry wars on vectors where their reach was supreme, where the grand calculation could predict outcomes within tolerances they found acceptable. Other legions distrusted the zeal with which the Iron Hands amputated weakness. They distrusted the quietness that had settled over the legion, a quiet that had the look of functionaries at a machine. The Mechanicum remained a complicated ally. There were lines of kinship there, languages in common, a shared religion of metal, but even the Adeptus Mechanicus regarded them with something that resembled apprehension. A man may worship the Omnicia and still fear that his fellow worshippers might set aside their rituals to become instruments of a darker liturgy. With isolation came a narrowing of horizons. Where the Iron Hands once took counsel from the High Lords of Terra and the Emperor's own strategy rooms, they began to consult their own machines more, to listen to the hum of data cores and the measured voice of the Council. The Iron Council had matured from a band of captains into the effective brain of the Legion. It took the scattered wills of many and synthesized them into policy. The Council did not speak in rhetoric, it proposed, it computed, it mandated. Grief, of course, persisted, grief underpinned everything, but it was ordered and codified rather than allowed to flare in legend or song. That codification produced structure, structure produced survival. In the decades after the heresy, the Iron Hands proved themselves over and over. They became specialists at siegecraft, at ordnance calculation, at the cessation of minuscule but lethal failures in supply lines and maintenance. They could take a world's manufactoria and, with machine-like efficiency, strip it into components that matched their need. When they came to a Xenos threat, they did not attempt to charm or negotiate, they performed kinetic autopsies and left no organ of resistance intact. When chaos cults rose like pustules on a planet's skin, the Iron Hands methodically excised them, treating the infection as an engineering problem as much as a moral one. Still, history is not only method. Enmity raged in human and machine hearts alike, and new threats forced their doctrines to adapt. Chaos continued to gnaw at the edges of reality, demon incursion, psychic rasping, war zones where nothing obeyed the normal rules of physics. When demon-forged weapons slid across a battlefield, the grand calculation had to be reweighted with new parameters for warp interference. Those who came to cut the flesh of the Iron Hands for scrap did not always know that the Legion had spent years modeling the behavior of corrupted minds and possessed weapons. They did not see the nights the Tech Marines stayed awake running diagnostics against spectral variables, or the gray, sleepless faces of servitors replaying engagement logs for anomalies. Xenos were harsher teachers. The Iron Hands met worlds of insectal swarms, void-born leviathans, and cold-thinking machine intelligences that refused to be reduced to familiar variables. Against tyrannid tides their attrition models had to swell to account for the biomass's capacity to adapt. Against Necron tomb technology the grand calculation had to include probability trees for phase-shifted armor. Against Eldar trickery they had to factor in misdirection and foresight. These wars sharpened them. They learned to accept redundancy not as inefficiency but as resilience, multiple independent systems able to take over if another failed. They learned to code denial-of-service attacks for psychic infiltration. They learned to build reliquaries of iron around their own hearts. This was not the same Ferris's Legion as before Istvan. The change was not skin-deep. The Iron Hands had become more certain, but that certainty had a cost. When the Legion sent emissaries to imperial governors or allied companies, those emissaries were clipped, precise, and often abrupt. There was an unspoken assumption that any alliance would be measured by its effectiveness and nothing else. Friendship was a risk, trust demanded audits. The Legion did not dance at triumphs, they recorded them and moved on. This practical stoicism produced triumphs and it estranged them. The inner life of the Legion evolved too. Rituals of mourning were replaced by maintenance cycles. Monuments rose where voices once chanted prayers. The forge mines became oracles, not of fate, but of necessity. In some commanders, the loss of Ferris calcified into a doctrine, the only truly loyal thing was a machine. Others retained a memory of the man who, despite his veneration of metal, still held some small human touch. Those men, few and quieter with time, kept private shrines where they polished an old gauntlet or told a new recruit the story of Ferris's laughter. Such acts were heretical and cherished, they were small rebellions against the totalizing logic of the Council. I will confess to my own failures here. I am a historian and I have catalogued the coldness without abandoning my sympathy for it. For every campaign I recorded, there were faces I saw in the mess halls, in the engine rooms, in the narrow corridors where two warriors passed with a nod and nothing more. I remember one sergeant, Ansel Breg, who had lost both legs at Istvan and came back with cog motors that whirred before he slept. He would polish the teeth of the cog sprockets as though they were instruments. He would speak sometimes, late at night, of dreams of snow on Medusa and of a voice that told him to be harder. We were weak, he told me once, as if the truth were a hammer blow no one could soften. We were weak. Now we are not. There is a dignity in his words and a despair I could not cure. Under the Iron Rule, the Legion undertook what they called the Purging Marches, campaigns that were both punitive and prophylactic. If a system showed signs of strain, the Iron Hands descended. They would purge traitor enclaves when they found them. They would assume control of failing manufactoria and reimpose discipline. They would sometimes leave a population chastened and functional, sometimes hollowed and resentful. Those marches had the advantageous clarity of purpose, symptoms identified, treatment administered, relapse monitored. But they also left scars on the imperial worlds that saw them pass. Alien governors would whisper that the Iron Hands healed the disease but poisoned the patient's will. The grand calculation expanded into civil governance in small places. On a handful of frontier worlds, the Iron Hands left behind cadres to maintain order and train local militias. In those places the Legion's presence saved thousands from Xenos depredation, but it also taught younger generations to value certainty over freedom. Children learned to salute steel as if it were the only god that kept hunger away. In later councils, when such worlds petitioned for relief or for political autonomy, the Legion's memos read like engineering assessments and not pleas for mercy. They prioritized survival metrics and logistic throughput. In time, some worlds thanked them for their stability. Others whispered that they had traded their souls for the safety of a counted ledger. It would be a lie to say the Iron Hands became heartless automatons. Under their ceramite hides beat memories of faces and old songs, and some of those songs were kept from dying by the whisperers among them, servitors who kept stories alive in their read-only memories, tech marines who carved oaths as much as schematics into their memory staves. But the culture shifted. When the council judged a captain for his reckless affection for his company's traditions, they did not reprimand him for sentiment. They examined the data. If his affection correlated with higher casualty rates, it was excised. If a tradition hardened bonds and, therefore, improved effectiveness, it was codified and then optimized. Their enemies took note. Where once a foe could rely on a rival's frailty or misjudgment, now the Iron Hands offered fewer openings. This made them formidable in attritional warfare. Their veterans were craftsmen of survival, and the sum of their modifications, a composite of steel, servo, and cold will, yielded a unit that could last where flesh alone would fail. But it made diplomacy brittle and allegiances conditional. When an ultramarine company asked for allied support during a campaign against a burgeoning chaos cult, the Iron Hands dispatched a contingent only after the council could see a statistical certainty of success. The ultramarines called them stubborn. Some called them merciless. A few whispered that their loyalty had been hollowed until only the echo remained. There were, of course, moments that tested them beyond calculation. During the Great Rift's early growths, warp storms stitched across sectors and the very fabric of communication buckled. The grand calculation stuttered in ways that tolerance tables had not modeled. In those dark seasons, the Legion reverted to that old ferocity, men and machines working beyond the neat graphs and certainty, because there was simply no time for computation. Those nights returned something to them, the smell of burning wood, the weight of a hand gripped in solidarity before a charge, the lean cry of a vexed commander rallying his men in an impossible moment. It lasted until the storm passed and then was folded back into doctrine as an exception case to be accounted for in future models. Time turned. The Iron Hands continued to fight chaos and Xenos alike. They earned grudging respect where once there had been only the cold of dread. They accumulated victories and losses in equal measure. The grand calculation grew and evolved. It became more than a tool, it became a habit of mind. New initiates learned to speak in probabilities. Old veterans who could not accept the new ways left and sought their fortunes elsewhere, wandering like ghosts through the Imperium, or they died on distant battlefields, their deaths catalogued and evaluated. As for me, Gas Havelock, my hand grows slower, but my memory is unyielding. I have watched the Iron Hands turn to their machines and find in that transformation both salvation and a subtle death. They survived. In a universe that hungers for sturdy survivors, they could scarcely have done otherwise. But survival demanded a price, the dilution of laughter into a functional metric, the replacement of improvisation with protocol, the replacement of shared tales with the ledger's silent rows. In the quiet hours, I sometimes return in my mind to the image of Ferrus Manus standing on a ridge on Medusa, his hands raised as if testing the wind, his gaze set not on conquest but on the endurance of a people. Would he have approved of what his sons became? I cannot say. He was a man who believed in the sharpening of tools, and he knew the value of iron. He also knew when to put a hand upon the shoulder of a brother and say nothing, when to let rest the history in a story rather than in an instruction set. The Iron Hands press on. They wage surgical wars, they patrol the outer reaches, they answer calls for aid from systems that need a steady hand. They do so as something more than a legion of men, as an organism of purpose that blends flesh and machine into a shape that will not break easily. They are isolated, by doctrine, by design, by necessity, and in that isolation they have found an unlovely freedom. They will not be soft, and they will not be sentimental. Where the galaxy expects warmth and mercy, they offer assurance. And so I close this chapter of my chronicle with no grand moral to impose. The universe is indifferent, and men and machines alike must choose how to meet that indifference. The Iron Hands chose calculation, vengeance, and rebirth. They paid in what they would not pay back. Perhaps there will come a time when they will see the cost in full and temper their doctrines with something more human. Perhaps they will march until the stars forget their names. I cannot say which is truer, only that both paths bear witness to an irrevocable fact: survival can make of us what our grief requires. I have written of wars and welds, of losses and of ledger entries. I have tried to keep the memory of Ferrus Manus alive in ink, not in idle. In the end, the Legion carries his shadow like polished armor, it protects and it hides. The grand calculation endures as both shield and sentence. The Iron Hands will continue to count and to kill, to repair and to replace, to stand at the edge of what the Imperium requires and do the work they deem necessary. They will be feared, they will be summoned, and on occasion they will be thanked. They will also be alone. If history requires a verdict, I offer none. I offer instead the simple record of what was seen and what was done, the names of those who fought and the shapes of their choices. Machines can be measured, calculations can be run, outcomes can be projected. But the quiet residue, the memory of a laugh, the echo of a hand laid upon another's shoulder, will not appear on any ledger. That residue is the thing that keeps me writing, for I believe that even in a legion that seeks to excise weakness, memory itself is a stubborn remnant that refuses to be replaced. When my hand rests finally, perhaps another will take this chronicle and continue the counting. Perhaps they will make a better arithmetic of compassion than the grand calculation ever attempted. Perhaps they will not. For now I set down my quill and listen to the distant, steady hum of a forge, iron being tested, refined, and, if one believes it so, kept warm with the embers of a memory that refuses to die. I have written this chronicle not to judge but to remember. The story of the Iron Hands is not a simple moral fable with tidy ends, it is a knot of choices and losses, of metal and marrow, hammered on different anvils and at different times. I have tried to follow those who chose iron over flesh and those who, like Ferrus Manus, once held both in uneasy balance. If anything binds these pages, it is the stubborn fact that even metal remembers. Ferrus had been, before the fracture, a man of measured certainties. He did not deny the utility of flesh, he understood its failures, but he did not hate it either. He sought remedy in augmentation because he believed in endurance, not because he wished to erase what made men human. That nuance matters. When his sons accepted steel as salvation, they imagined they were honoring him, yet in many ways they enacted the opposite. They took from his creed the cruelest reading: flesh must be excised, and left behind the gentler lessons about craft, restraint, and the care of those one leads. Grief is an odd artisan. It sharpens and it dulls in the same sweep. After Istvan, grief carved the Iron Hands down to a new form: cleaner lines, fewer redundancies of compassion, a smoother gait across war-torn worlds. The grand calculation was their answer to a universe that had betrayed them. It is not entirely wrong, there is beauty in a machine that functions as intended, we have always admired instruments that serve their purpose. Yet when the price of that effectiveness is the slow erosion of informal kindness, of those soft protocols by which men shepherd men, the ledger demands a second column. I have seen them in both columns. I have seen a techmarine oil a servo-arm with hands that trembled, I have seen a veteran close the eyes of the boy he could not save and then, in private, count the days until he could be replaced with something less fallible. I have recorded captains who teach recruits to measure the enemy's likely move before they teach them how to tell a joke. These are not contradictions but truths braided together. The Iron Hands can be both unsparing and deeply wounded. Their machine skin does not mean an absence of pain. The legacy of Ferrus is therefore a living paradox. In the iron they found a bulwark against treachery and chance, in the memory of him they found a reason to continue. They rewired grief into doctrine and doctrine into action. Their revenge and their reforms saved worlds, ended cults, and bought time for the fragile weave of the Imperium. Yet each victory settled a small debt: the loss of spontaneity, the narrowing of compassion, the thinning of voices at the mess table that used to speak of home. When I walk the forges now, I still look for the small, human things. A scrap of worn cloth tied to a stanchion. The faded etching of a face on an old gauntlet. A whispered story at midnight about a pre-march who once laughed at a worn joke. These small relics do what no ledger can, they insist that the men beneath the ceramite were once more than their functions. To the iron hands, such relics are at odds with the grand calculation. To me they are evidence that humanity persists even when it is inconvenient. Philosophically, the balance remains unresolved. There is no final equation that reconciles the need for survival with the need for mercy. The iron hands press towards certainty because certainty protects. They press away from softness because softness can be a doorway to betrayal. Both instincts are legible and defensible. Both carry their costs. Perhaps history's cruelest lesson is that there is no posture that saves everyone, any stance chosen will leave others bereft. What, then, should be the historian's final note? I cannot prescribe the legion's soul, nor should I pretend to imagine its future with certainty. I can only record what I have seen, a people remade by loss, a doctrine forged from grief, and a memory of a pre-march who was neither wholly machine nor merely man. The iron hands keep their promise to endure. In doing so they have become at once a safeguard and a warning. If a reader finds in these pages a single instruction, let it be this: measure the cost of your remedies. When a wound is healed by removing what made the wounded person who they are, ask whether the cure is worth the vanishing. The iron hands chose survival, they paid. They also preserved something precious, the capacity to act when calamity comes, and for that the Imperium owes them a great, thankless debt. I set down my quill with no triumph, only with a tired respect. Memory is an act of care. To remember Ferrus Menace and his sons is to hold both their wounds and their deeds in my hand, and to leave them for whoever comes after me to read. In the quiet after the forge, when the machines hum and the living move between them, I hear the echo of a laugh that once warmed an anvil. The sound is faint. It is human. It will not, I suspect, be replaced.